Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. We have a lot of very interesting weather to talk about today, including the possibility of quite a significant storm with the potential for heavy snowfall and then possibly a cold spell, perhaps a significant one as we move into 2025. And all of that will be explained shortly in detail, why, when and where. So I thought I'd start off though by showing the overall pattern as we move from 2024 into 2025. And this is the weekly mean pressure anomaly from the European model here. Areas in pink showing above average pressure and areas in blue showing below average pressure. And you can see this is the latest one from today, and the kind of bright or dark pink sort of, but the pink colours across the northern latitudes indicate fairly decent signal for blocking, and actually it's already setting up. We've got high pressure across the northern latitudes, the North Atlantic there, with a fairly significant area of troughing across parts of northern Europe, and that's actually bringing down a northerly flow into parts of the UK, initially across the north, and that's going to basically start in the next few days with the potential for significant snowfall on Monday and Tuesday into parts of Scotland, probably the far north, as you can see there. But if we take a look at the temperature chart, we've just about got that cold air in place. It's fairly significant actually, minus 11 degrees at 850 hectopascals. That's a fairly good indication that the air mass is very cold, and where it's below minus 5 degrees, that's typically showing the air mass being cold enough for snow. And you can see, so that cold air is already in place across the far north as of pretty much today, or the end of today, and we're going to get a weather front pushing into that early on Tuesday, and that's going to be preceding a much more significant low, but possibly we could be looking at a few centimetres of snow by the end of Tuesday across northern parts of Scotland. Over high ground could be as much as 10-20 centimetres or so. And actually we can take a look at the UKV here, and let's see what it's showing. Yeah, so it's showing kind of 5 to 10 centimetres for lower ground on Monday, and then another round of snow pushing in. So yeah, even by the end of Tuesday, pretty significant totals, as you can see, focus across high ground. Population fairly low here, and the highest population areas are not on the mountains, so unlikely to be extremely significant, but definitely something to look out for. That's going to be the first risk of kind of snow and cold in this upcoming cold spell. However, you will notice on this chart we do actually have a fairly decent signal for low pressure in the Atlantic, and that is this low right here. Essentially has been hovering around the middle of the Atlantic basin for the last few days, and it will really continue to do so. As you can see, if I just track this through, watch what happens. It just really kind of lingers there. The most interesting thing about this low is that it's going to inject. Well, actually, if I show you that, if you can see the surface pressure pattern, we have high pressure to the east of it, we have high pressure to the west, so the only really path it can move is up through the middle, and it's going to start injecting some of its energy into the jet stream, which is going to be coming roughly something like that. It's going to inject its energy into the jet stream and potentially going to help deepen a low into the UK. And that's that happening right here. You can see it emerges from the broader low pressure system, and then it starts to develop its own pressure center. This is by Tuesday evening. And then you can see it actually deepens quite strongly as it pushes into the UK, bumps into colder air, which is now flooding in from the north, as we explained with this. And then as a result, we get a fairly significant storm with heavy snow, potentially very strong winds, and possibly some blizzard conditions in places. So zooming in on this threat here, which is going to be the first widespread threat of severe weather, this is fairly confident. We're fairly confident it's now going to be on New Year's Day, and I'll just quickly show you some of the current model, kind of the model consensus on that. So this is the GFS here. And you can see it deepens not super rapidly, it's only kind of a few millibars an hour, but it does deepen enough that we have fairly tight isobars. A fairly large amount of vertical motion on the northern side means that we have kind of heavy precipitation, which turns to snow. And in this kind of scenario, we are looking at kind of 5, 10, 15, maybe even as much as a foot of snow where you get under that snow band. And this scenario is kind of tracking across parts of Ireland, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England. On the southern half of that, I mean, while it's not particularly deep low, we do have something interesting, which is we've got a ridge of high pressure to the west, and we also have high pressure down south and to the east, which means the isobars are going to be fairly tight. The pressure gradient is going to be quite significant, as you can see here. So the winds will be stronger than your typical low of this depth, similar to Storm Dara few weeks ago now. And so the GFS is suggesting we're going to have a pretty significant inland wind threat of 60, 70 mile an hour wind gusts across parts of Wales and England, also maybe across parts of Ireland there too. However, this is really not a done deal, and if I show you the European model, this is called the Dalmatian plot. Each of these small dots, actually let me just explain first, this is the chart for Wednesday at midday, and each of these small dots is showing you different possible positions of the low pressure system. The colour shows the intensity, the brighter the colour, so those blues towards greens, showing a much deeper low. And it's always the case that the deeper the low, the further north it will be, at least in the UK, and you can see that trend again quite clearly there. So still, there is the outside chance we get a very deep low, 975 or so millibars, which could pose a much more widespread wind threat, but the snow would be confined to areas further north. The general kind of middle ground at the moment is for the kind of GFS type path from parts of Northern Ireland into parts of central England, which would then bring snow to the north of that, so southern Scotland and northern England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then heavy rain but strong winds to the south. However, there is still also a couple of scenarios where that low is a lot further south, we get snow into the Midlands, but the low is a lot weaker, so the strong wind threat is not present. And we can actually see these on all the different model scenarios. So the European model, probably similar to GFS generally, but notice how the wind threat is not as present, so kind of hard to say with that. But still, on the northern side, we get significant snowfall into northern England, southern Scotland, and Northern Ireland, parts of Ireland as well. So this is currently the area that's at highest risk. So I think generally probably looking north of the Midlands for the snow threat, but it's worth saying where this does happen, the snow will be very heavy and potentially large kind of depth as well, and that's the European model showing similar things there, 10-15 centimeters in this scenario. However, just to kind of prove my point, okay, I mean, I've kind of proved the opposite, but the icon is showing fairly decent agreement there on a similar scenario, as you can see. But if we take a look at the French model, the arpège, this is a much further south low. It's also weaker, so the wind threat is not quite as strong. And because the pressure gradient is not quite strong, we don't quite bring in the cold air enough to undercut. So this is, if you like cold and snow, this is probably the worst scenario, which would just be snow confined to high ground across parts of northern England and Wales, with heavy rain for most other people. The one thing I will say, which some people have been mentioning a bit, is that these lows often tend to trend further south. Now that is true to a degree, but I think this potentially might be slightly different, and that's because we've got a fairly strong area of high pressure across the continent. That's 1,032 millibars, fairly decent, and you can see it's fairly strong and stable area of high pressure, and so I don't think we're going to be getting significant trends south to the point where this suddenly becomes a southern England and Midlands event, which has happened before. So while I do think some southern shifts are possible, and actually even if we compare between the midday and the 6 o'clock run, there has been a slight southern shift there, as you can see, but I just think in terms of kind of the risk area, right now it's probably north of the Midlands. Let's just wait for this to update here. I think right now it's probably north of the Midlands, generally northern regions of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I don't know if this is going to cooperate or not. But if I show you the UKV scenario, which I think is a fairly reasonable bet, which is a kind of nice middle ground, that is heavy snowfall develops across parts of Northern Ireland, northern areas of Ireland and Northern Ireland, the country, and then also heavy snow initially across high ground into southern Scotland and northern England, but it does become more widespread, even into parts of central Scotland there, and that would be fairly significant. We're looking at, potentially up to a foot of snow in places. So generally the theme is we do know there's going to be significant heavy snow somewhere. We just don't quite know, is it going to be more into central areas of Scotland and the Highlands, or is it maybe going to be slightly further south? I think probably the most south it's going to go, at least at this point, is this sort of region here. That's your kind of best bet if you're kind of snow lover in the south, the Midlands, but I think this, with a little bit of southward shift, is the general area at high risk. So if you're kind of anywhere in this red zone, here, definitely keep an eye out for the forecast, but it's kind of this corridor here which is most at risk for heavy snow at the moment. In terms of the wind risk though, I think this is probably slightly less uncertain. We do know it's going to be across the south, and most certainly that's going to be southern England. And the UKV shows a fairly decent storm here, 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts inland, locally 70 miles an hour, and higher along the coasts. That's kind of the second or third significant windstorm in this region this winter, so it could be some damage to trees which have already been weakened. The Met Office has got warnings out for this already, but I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'm probably expecting them, if trends remain the way they've been going, to get a named storm at some point in the next few days. So that's basically going to be all of Wednesday. Strong winds across the south, heavy snow across the north, and then things will start to quieten down for a little while. And I can show you the charts here. So this is the GFS model. Again, there's our storm. What we actually are expecting, and this has got quite good model confidence, is that we're going to have a fairly strong northerly flow on the backside of that low. Let's see if I can show you the... Yeah, so this is... I showed this chart earlier. I'll just give a quick explainer again in case you've forgotten. But this is the temperature in the level of the atmosphere where the pressure equals this value. Essentially, it's saying the temperature at 1.5 kilometers above the ground, roughly. And that's, like I said earlier, a very good indication of the air mass. And you can see, as that low exits to the east, a strong pressure gradient on the western side brings in a pretty significant cold air from the north. So widely, we're looking at that -5 level, which, like I said earlier, is typically conducive for snow. So Wednesday night into Thursday, and then Friday, it's going to feel pretty cold. We also are going to have the risk of snow showers across both northern and eastern coasts. Probably by Thursday and Friday, that risk is going to be diminishing, and I'll look at why shortly. But especially Wednesday into Thursday, we're going to be seeing snow showers across the north. So that's kind of the most immediate threat of significant weather. And initially, we thought that was going to be it for the cold spell. And I talked about these weekly anomalies last week, which showed the high pressure collapsing down to the south, and then bear in mind this is the chart from 2 days ago, and then eventually just kind of becoming more of a... Sorry, I don't know what I've clicked there. So the kind of... A couple of days ago, the general model consensus was that high pressure would collapse from the north down into areas further south, and we'd be left with a mild zonal flow, nothing exciting, nothing particularly cold, just settled and slightly chilly. Like I said, nothing interesting. Now, that's still the case, but there's been a kind of added nuance. And if I show you the ensembles, this is the GFS, what is it? Let's see. So this is the GEFS ensemble, so essentially the average of all the different model kind of members, the different scenarios that we could have, and it shows the low coming through very nicely. Like I said, we've got fairly strong confidence on that, significant weather on the 1st of January. And then it does actually show the high pressure. Actually, this is the previous run. Let me show you the earlier one because it kind of proves my point slightly better. It does actually show that high pressure, which was building towards Greenland, then collapsing to the south. As you can see, by this point, it's then over us and it's less cold. And the European model has the same thing. Let me find the ensembles there. Sorry. So you can see this was showing a similar thing. There's our big low, or the first. And then we get into a northerly flow, but the high pressure does eventually collapse into the UK. And while it's cold and slightly chilly, it's not extremely notable. But that has now slightly started to change. And bearing this in mind, this is a chart from 2 days ago. If we look at the chart from today, look what happens for the second week of January. And I'm going to say this is quite a positive thing if you're a fan of cold weather. That high pressure actually remains across the high latitudes. We're probably closer to high pressure, but potential for a continued northerly or easterly flow. And if I look at the next chart, take this with a grain of salt, but that is probably the best chart for cold weather I've seen in a very long time. Potentially, as we move into the second half of January, bringing in winds from the east. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If we first take a look at this one in more detail, high pressure across the northern latitudes, potentially some ridging extending towards the south across the UK. But take a look at that. The Atlantic is still kind of awake, and we're potentially going to be seeing mild incursions and low pressure systems, which might bring the risk of significant snowfall the second week of January. Now, I typically really don't like to talk about cold weather and cold spells and snow more than a week out, but I think it's probably worth it this time because unusually we have pretty good model consensus for a renewed round of blocking high pressure setting up across the across the northern latitudes, which reinforce the situation with regards to cold weather. And that is all because of our kind of warm air advection across the eastern half of the kind of North American continent. That essentially pumps up the air into the North Atlantic and then reinforces a high. And it's actually because of the initial collapse of that high pressure towards the southeast that enables that to occur. And if I show you, all of the big three models now develop blocking again to the north. There's a GFS, high pressure, cold air, mild incursions. I'll look more into that into a bit. It was even stronger actually on the previous run, which I don't think you can see super well. But there we go, similar thing. Blocking to the north, mild air, incursions, and bear in mind this is at kind of more than a week's range, and the model uncertainty is unusually quite low. If I show you the European model, this is a slightly different scenario, but ends up with a fairly similar outcome, as in cold weather, the blocking's closer to us, but you still get very cold air on the eastern, across basically the UK. If I show you the Canadian model, you can see similar thing, blocking from the high latitudes into the North Atlantic there. You can see right there, brings in a cold northerly/northeasterly in the second week of January, kind of the 5th, the 6th onwards. Now it's worth saying the uncertainty is still high, and if I show you the ensembles, this is the GFS ensemble, we do have strong confidence that following the passage of the storm on the 1st, we're going to be remaining cold for at least the first week of January. Probably not snowy from kind of this period onwards. Bear in mind this is for London. The Midlands North will be snowy on the 1st, or probably Northern England into Scotland will be snowy on the 1st. So it will be cold. We do know that. There's high confidence on that. But actually, even beyond that point, we are looking at a fairly decent model signal for cold weather, perhaps extending even towards the middle of the month. Now, naturally, there are a couple solutions for milder weather, but I am cautiously quite optimistic on the potential for a perhaps more prolonged cold spell, and that's for recent standards. This is not going to be any historic winter. This is not going to be like 1962, 1963. It's not going to be 2010, at least at this stage. But potentially, in terms of recent years, this could be maybe the best since December 2022. So I am, like I said, cautiously optimistic. Of course, as we go into the longer range, it is just anyone's guess what happens. There's always a very large uncertainty there. But it's quite unusual to see the models agree like they do now, and there is the potential for some higher end scenarios. This is the midnight run of the GFS. Now, please don't take this too literally because it's just one run. But this is a possible scenario which we're looking at, which is if the Atlantic remains fairly active. We don't want it to be too active, as I'll show you soon. And we still get renewed blocking across the northern latitudes, as the kind of European model means suggest, and as quite a few of the models have been suggesting. Then there is the potential that we get these kind of battleground scenarios, which is precipitation pushing in from the south and having potential snow events across the country. Now, this output that the GFS is showing is very extreme, and admittedly, I don't think it's going to happen. But I do think we have the increased probability of cold weather and significant snow in January. Bear in mind, if your kind of usual probability is like 2%, this is maybe 5 or 10%. So it's not particularly high, but it's elevated, and I just thought I'd kind of let you guys know. So there's a fairly decent signal now. We know kind of for the first, we're going to be stormy and snowy. These days are going to be cold and settled, but potentially the 5th and the 6th onwards, I'd be definitely looking out for a possible more cold, more blocked pattern. On the flip side of that, there are models, so this is the GFS here, actually still does show those kind of battleground cold scenarios, but potentially as we move onwards, we are looking at a return to mild conditions. And if you just take a look at the ensembles, like I said, really anything is possible, and it's completely on the table that even though the models are clustering towards cold at the moment, for kind of the 6th onwards, we end up in one of these milder scenarios there. What I will say, though, is in terms of the MJO, I have seen some talk that this is perhaps the MJO is really weak right now, so it's not showing much kind of credibility, but I do generally quite like it. I think it's a fairly good tool, and right now we are exactly entering phases 7, and eventually we're going to be going through to kind of phase 8 around the first, basically 2 weeks of January. And phases 7 and 8, as I've talked about before, are typically quite conducive for blocking. That's phase 7, that's phase 8. Both of those kind of show patterns which are conducive to colder weather. So I think if it's any time of the year, this is probably the time for it to happen. And like I said, I am cautiously optimistic. Please, though, don't get your hopes up. Don't get overly excited, because there is significant agreement for the kind of first week or so, the first few days, especially the first, to be cold and possibly snowy, especially across the north. There is still high uncertainty here. But even showing this is a European model ensemble, the mean, low pressure to the east, high pressure to the north, cold northeasterly, and for this to be a week out and to have the -5 all over the UK, I'm relatively impressed. Potentially also showing some hints of the battleground. This is the low pressure pushing up from the south, and then maybe the chance of snow. So, like I said, uncertainty is very high, but I am cautiously optimistic. I'd be really looking out for the 4th to the 5th, and then onwards. That's when the potential is for a more interesting spell of cold weather. But like I said, we do have the threats starting kind of on Monday and then all the way into New Year's, the first week of January, being cold and settled anyway. So I am going to, of course, be giving you updates. I'll do probably a video every day until the 2nd. Unfortunately, I am actually away in Scotland, so it's definitely not unfortunate for me. Unfortunately, I probably won't be doing videos on the 3rd, 4th or 5th, because I'm going to be doing some mountain climbing, which I'm very excited about. Hopefully it will be snowy there. And then on the 6th, of course, going back to school, so I will have videos returning then. But anyway, that's about it for today. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed this. Remember, don't get your hopes up, but be cautiously optimistic for the weather in the next few days. And have a great day. Bye-bye.